Okay, so our next speaker is Mark Devlin, and he's going to be speaking about the darker side of the music industry, and with a specific focus on those lovable four mop tops known as John, Paul, George and Ringo, the Beatles. My favourite band. I've been a big fan ever since it was that high. So my illusions have been shattered by Mark the last year or two.
That's what I'm here for. That's what I do. That's my job.
So Mark has actually spoken at the last two Up Minds. This is his third event, so he's part of the furniture here now, aren't you, Mark?
Yeah, I've been here more than you, I think.
So without any further ado, a big warm welcome to Mark Devlin.
Well, thanks very much. It's great to be back. And all weekend we've been hearing from speakers talking about the official version of various things and offering alternative takes on them. Whether it's the notion that 5G is perfectly harmless and nothing to worry about, whether it's the idea that vaccines are perfectly safe for human health, whether it's that fluoride in the water is there to protect dental cavities, so who cares if it shuts down our pineal gland as long as we all have nice teeth, right? So my talk is a variation on that dynamic. It might seem quite trivial compared to some of the other subjects we've heard talked about, particularly the last one. But if you're anything like me, you won't enjoy being mugged off and taken for a fool. And when we look at this subject, it does offer opportunities to learn a lot about how mass mind control and the manufacturing of public heroes and role models works. Psyops, basically, against the general public. So we'll look at some of the tactics that are used as we go through this talk. It is about the Beatles, and I'm not here specifically to bash this particular group. The reason I talk about them is because they are just so bloody fascinating. And the story of the Beatles could tie up a researcher full time for an entire career. There's that much to study about them. And indeed, there are many researchers out there that delve into hidden aspects of this particular group. They're so much more interesting than the Rolling Stones or any other group you might care to mention. So I'm not here to deliberately have a go at the Beatles. I actually am a big fan of their music. I think they put out some great songs. And it's actually very difficult for me to be presenting this information. I would prefer not to be. I would like to be up here telling you that these guys really were four regular working class lads from Liverpool who just happened to become a cultural phenomenon and the most successful and influential group of all time against all the odds. And all it came down to was them putting together a band, writing a few catchy songs, putting together a few guitar riffs, doing a bit of hustling, playing a few gigs, and the rest just happened naturally in that way. I think probably most of us here realise that society doesn't work quite that way. So let's get into some of the content. A good place to start would be with the formation of the group and the choice of the name that they came to settle on for it. So when we delve into the back history of this group, we find that John Lennon, who put the collective together, first called it the Blackjacks. It then morphed into the Quarrymen, and then there were further monikers such as Johnny and the Moondogs, the Nurk Twins for just 2 days, the Beatles spelt with 2 A's, then it became the Silver Beatles, the Silver Beats, then the Silver Beatles with an EA, before eventually surviving as the Beatles. John Lennon famously has offered a rather cryptic explanation as to why they settled on the eventual name of the group. And he said, "It came in a vision, a man appeared on a flaming pie and said unto them, from this day forward you are Beatles with an A. Thank you, Mr. Man," they said, thanking him. So this seems to me to be an example of masterful speaking that we get in Freemasonry, and we'll be encountering much more of this as we go on. But it's very far from a clear statement explaining how the naming of the group came around. It's interesting to consider this work from Aleister Crowley, the notorious British occultist from the Victorian era onwards. Now, this guy pops up in the backstory of the corporate music industry like the proverbial bad penny. Everywhere you look, you get the influence of Aleister Crowley. So one of his works was titled The Winged Beetle. And in this, we get coded the name of two groups of which Paul McCartney was a member. I don't know which Paul McCartney, we'll cover that as we go on. But of course, Wings and the Beatles. So it's not too much of a stretch to consider that this work may well have influenced the naming of those groups. Going back into Egyptian mythology then, in that culture there was a creature known as a scarab beetle, a particular species of scarab beetle. And this was known for rolling its dung up into a ball and rolling it across the ground with its back legs, as we can see here. And to the ancient Egyptians, this symbolized the sun being rolled across the sky each day as it went from its sunrise to its zenith and eventually to its sunset. So the beetle came to symbolize that process within that culture. Here's an inscription, again detailing the scarab beetle with an icon of the sun at the very top there. Let's throw in the family coat of arms here of George Martin, often known as the fifth Beatle. He was their producer. He was responsible for their distinctive sound. He was with them pretty much from the start all the way through to their final days. And he was very much a part of the British establishment. He came from an aristocratic family. We'll be encountering a bit more about him as we go on. But this coat of arms was drawn up for George Martin sort of in his latter period, sometime in the 90s, I believe it was. And when we study it, we can see that there are three of these scarab beetles that we've just encountered within the crest of this coat of arms. And it's very interesting to consider that there are only three rather than four. Okay, this guy is John Lennon's old man, Freddie Lennon, who was a seafarer, a mariner. He was often away at sea, but he was also a bit of a budding musician himself on an amateur basis. So he put out some records, and there was this one called That's My Life, which is misspelt here as That's My Live, but it's quite catchy. You can get it on YouTube, and when you listen to it, you're struck by just how similar John Lennon sounded to his old man Freddie. Their voices are very similar. But the distinctive thing about this particular record and the sleeve that it came in is the black and white checkerboard design that we get there, which we find on the floor of Masonic temples, symbolizing base consciousness, as we heard about from Nathan earlier today. So this is our first tenuous foray into the world of Freemasonry and some possible links with the Beatles. And that same idea of black and white duality, which symbolizes the duality that is inherent in nature, whereby everything has a polar opposite. So there's night and day, there's light and dark, there's good and evil, there's male and female. And we had another expression of this on the famous Abbey Road sleeve, which often gets missed, I would suggest. So you've got the group walking across the zebra crossing. There's all kinds of symbolism encoded into this sleeve, particularly when you get into the idea that Paul McCartney may not be who we think he is. And there have been two Paul McCartneys at least, by the way, but that really is something for another presentation. But you also have the black and white stripes on the zebra crossing, again symbolizing light and dark and night contrasted with day. It's another expression of the black and white checkerboard idea. Back to the very early days of the Beatles then, and when the group originally settled on its final lineup, we had 5 members. So as well as John, George and Paul, you had Stuart Sutcliffe, who was the original bassist before Paul McCartney took over, and the original drummer was Pete Best, who was in there before Ringo took over. And Pete Best had a mother known as Mona Best. Well, most of us have mothers, right? And he did too, but his happened to be called Mona Best. And she owned the Casbah Coffee Club in Liverpool, which was one of the venues alongside the Cavern where the Beatles played some of their early gigs in their hometown. So at that time, there were a couple of associates of the Beatles who were with them pretty much through their entire career. One of them was a guy called Mel Evans, who we'll also encounter later. And the other one was a dude called Neil Aspinall, who worked as a roadie and a general assistant, and very much a tried and trusted confidant of the Beatles. He was with there every step of the way. And there's this fascinating story of, at the time, Neil Aspinall moving in with Pete Best and living in his house, and he just happened to impregnate Pete Best's mother, you know, like you do. And the result was the result was a son who was known as Rogue Best. So you had this very bizarre scenario where you got all these young lads in their early 20s, and one of them has knocked up the mother of one of his mates, which is a little bit awkward. So pretty soon after that, we found that Pete was kicked out of the band, and he was replaced by Ringo Starr. And the story we get there is that Pete was a good-looking lad back in the day, and the others in the group were a bit concerned about all the attention that he was getting from the ladies, so they replaced him with Ringo, and that's the problem solved. And it just reminds me of this little gag that we had in a Beatles press conference in 1966, where a reporter asked, "Is Ringo the best drummer in the world?" And John Lennon replied, "Ringo isn't even the best drummer in the Beatles." So back to Stuart Sutcliffe, the original bassist. And here he is in an early photograph which dates back to pre-fame Beatles days. So this is before the group has broken through, before they've become a household name with their first hit in the UK, which was Love Me Do, in October 1962. This picture is from a year or two before that. And we see him striking a very interesting hand sign as he sits there in the chair. He's arranging his hands in this pyramidical shape. And this, in occult secret society circles, is known as a triangle of manifestation. It represents the Trinity that's, again, inherent in creation. And the idea is that if you align your thoughts, emotions, and actions all according to a particular goal, a particular aim, something that you wish to bring into physical manifestation, you can make that happen. So it's very interesting that we find Anton LaVey, the founder and high priest of the Church of Satan, flashing up the same sign here. We get a different version of it from Stuart Sutcliffe, who's holding it just below his sacrum chakra there, and presumably trying to bring something about in that way. Another early picture we get of Stuart Sutcliffe is this one where he's behind a gate, and we've got the spirals of the gate arranged in a fashion that denotes 666, that fascinating number that crops up time and time again in this story. So Stuart Sutcliffe was engaged to a German girl by the name of Astrid Kircher, who was a photographer. We're going to look at some of her work in a minute. And he just happened to pass away at the ripe old age of 21 in 1962. This is right before the Beatles broke through and became world famous. So Stuart Sutcliffe is said to have got involved in a fight in Hamburg back in the days when the group were playing these sordid, rough venues in Hamburg. And a fight broke out one night. There was this fracas. Stu apparently got kicked in the head, according to the story, and it led to him developing a brain aneurysm from which he passed away shortly afterwards. So that was the removal of Stuart from the group. Paul McCartney stepped up to become the bassist, and now you have the final lineup of the Beatles intact: John, Paul, George, and Ringo, as we all know. According to this guy, Dr. John Coleman, in this book that he put out in 1991 titled Conspiracist Hierarchy, The Story of the Committee of 300, he claims that the Beatles were actually a product of the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations in London, which is this think tank organization that specializes in social engineering agendas, in training the general public in how to think about certain things, and in creating trends and movements and fads and this type of thing. Now, unfortunately, Coleman, who was a former British intelligence agent turned whistleblower, doesn't offer any kind of documentary evidence or citation to these claims. So he comes out in the book and states quite boldly that the Beatles were associated with the Tavistock Institute and also the Frankfurt School, which is very similar to Tavistock, coming out of Germany, also involved with social engineering. Coleman's claim was that many of the Beatles' lyrics weren't actually written by Lennon and McCartney, as we were told, but were actually penned by a guy known as Theodor Adorno, who was one of the principal founders of the Frankfurt School. So in a quote from the book, we hear, Theodor W. Adorno was well known to Tavistock. He was known as the Karl Marx of music. Adorno called his sound corrosive and unacceptable, and it was based on a 12 atonal system consisting of heavy, repetitive sounds. He started writing all his songs using this system. Adorno believed the bourgeoisie wanted music that didn't bother them or make them think. Tavistock wanted to pass on these new musical experiences to new audiences affecting the masses. So Uncomfortable Music was born. So it is unfortunate that we get nothing to back up these claims, but it wouldn't surprise me if it turned out to be the case that the Beatles didn't actually write all the songs that they were credited with. People might be familiar with Mike Williams, also known as Sage of Quay. He's got a great YouTube channel out there, he's got a great podcast, and he's really delved into the subject of the Beatles being a mind control psyop, particularly with the McCartney state of affairs. And he's got a show which is due to come out very soon, I believe, where he's examining from a professional musician's point of view whether it was actually physically possible for Lennon and McCartney to have written as many tracks as we're told they did. It gets into the hundreds and hundreds over the course of the Beatles' 7-year career. And he's worked out that they would have had to have written a song like something like every 3 to 4 days consistently for 7 years to have actually been responsible for all the songs we're told they did. So as well as writing all the songs for the Beatles, they're supposed to have given away songs to other artists as well, such as the Rolling Stones, Mary Hopkin, Marmalade, so many other groups. So it becomes interesting to speculate on whether those two did actually write all those songs, but of course it doesn't prove that Theodore Adorno actually did. It just raises the idea that this could have been in place. This is according to an interesting blog on the Beatles. It states, the Beatles' ascension to the top rung of the rock and roll pantheon, displacing Elvis Presley and American rock legends, was rigged and engineered into place by the British Crown and British military intelligence. For instance, in August '63, at their first major TV appearance at the London Palladium, the newspaper reported that police had to hold back 1,000 squealing teenagers, but the story was fabricated. The newspaper photo actually tightly cropped 3 screaming teenagers and claimed it was 1,000. Similarly, Beatlemania hysteria was manufactured at JFK Airport in February of '64, and this story has been confirmed by multiple sources, by the way, when the Beatles arrived in the USA to perform for the Ed Sullivan Show. Busloads of girls from a Bronx school were paid by Beatles promoters to scream hysterically when the Beatles got off the plane and went into the terminal. So by that point, they weren't particularly well known, and this dynamic was put into place whereby the American public was entrained to think of them as this wonderful group that they all must embrace because these screaming teenagers at the airport know what's what. Let's get into the symbolism contained in some very key Beatles record sleeves then. So this was their breakthrough album that appeared in 1963, titled With the Beatles. And the photography for this album and a couple of the other famous ones came from a guy called Robert Freeman. And rather synchronistically, he just happens to have passed away the other day on the 7th of November at the age of 82. So he was responsible for putting together this photo shoot, which was done in Bournemouth in England. And he seems to be something of a master of flimsy cover stories for how picture photo shoots came around. So his story regarding this one is that they only had an hour in which to complete the photo shoot, and the only place that they could do it was in the corridor of a hotel. And the light was very dim, and it was very far from perfect, and it resulted in this effect on the sleeve, which doesn't strike me as very convincing when you get into symbolic ideas. What we have here is half of the Beatles' faces shaded. So this brings about the idea of them embracing their shadow selves, as we heard about in a previous talk. We also get one eye being illuminated while the other one is in the dark. So again, it's duality, and it's ideas of the all-seeing eye, the eye of providence, the pineal gland. There's so much being communicated with this picture beyond it being a dimly lit corridor in some Bournemouth hotel. This is a still from a 1962 French movie called La Jetée. And we have similar ideas being conveyed here 1 year before that particular Beatles album came out. Could this have been an inspiration for Robert Freeman? We also have a photo shoot done by Astrid Kircher, who was the fiancée of Stuart Sutcliffe there in Germany. And she put together this set of photos. We have John Lennon here with half his face in shadow, one eye visible, the other one outside. And the same thing here with George Harrison. So Given that this predated the With the Beatles sleeve, it certainly seems feasible that they provided some kind of inspiration for Robert Freeman to put together that album sleeve the way he did. The other iconic one that he worked on was Help, the album that came out in 1965. And the story we got here was that you have the four lads spelling out the letters of the title of the album, Help, in semaphore. So you assume that what you're getting is the H, the E, the L, and the P. But it doesn't work out that way. Here's a quote from Robert Freeman. He says, "I had the idea of semaphore spelling out the letters help, but when we came to do the shot, the arrangement of the arms with those letters didn't look good. So we decided to improvise and ended up with the best graphic positioning of the arms." Well, we're back here to our old mate, Aleister Crowley, because one of the secret society mystery schools that he headed up for a time was the OTO, the Ordo Templo Orientis, and we have a system of grade signs within that particular organization, which appear to be getting replicated by the Beatles on this album sleeve. So these grade signs represent different elements and different ideas and different expressions within those mystery school teachings. And the closest that we get to the grade signs being shown here on that sleeve are these four: Osiris slain, Isis mourning, Apophis, and Osiris risen, which is the position taken by Paul, interestingly. So there they are superimposed. That's as close as we get to them. So it would appear that the idea of the Beatles spelling out the letters help is yet another flimsy cover story that doesn't quite stack up under the light of scrutiny. Another version of the Help sleeve was this rare Dutch version of the album that came out. And in the background, you have what appears to be the corporate logo of the Shell Oil Corporation. You assume that's what it is. But in fact, that's never actually been a shell. All along, that corporate logo has been designed to represent the rays of the rising sun. So we're into solar worship cults here. The Beatles 65, in the same year, you had the four lads posing under umbrellas for no ostensible reason. So let's get a bit further into the etymology of the word umbrella, which is derived in part from this word in Latin, umbra, and this definition of it states that it's late 16th century, denoting a phantom or a ghost, from the Latin meaning literally shade. I did a very interesting podcast a few years ago with a researcher named Lennon Honor, and he was looking into the music video for Rihanna's song Umbrella. And he was stating that, according to his research, what she appears to be depicting in that song and video is demonic possession. In the lyrics, she appears to be talking about being under the protection of her lover, her partner, but in actual fact, when you read between the lines, she's talking about being under the influence of this demonic entity that has entered into her. And that's why the title of the song is Umbrella, because it's talking about, you know, this phantom ghost aspect of that word. So that's an interesting one to throw into the mix and consider as to why the Beatles were pictured there under umbrellas. And it's not the only photo that we get of them under umbrellas, by the way. There are others out there. This is the Rolling Stones album, their Satanic Majesty's Request, and this came out in December '67. At the tail end of the year that was known as the first summer of love. And it's very much an homage or a pastiche of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album, which had appeared 6 months earlier on the 1st of June. This one was released on the 1st of December. What we see cleverly encoded into the album sleeve here, in among all the other elaborate artwork, is the four members of the Beatles. They've been hidden in the artwork that we get. So there's Paul, George, John, and Ringo in their various positions. This reinforces the observation that the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, very far from being rivals, were actually allies and were very good friends. It's documented that they used to party together and hang out together. And this is a great example of a dialectic which is often presented to us by the social engineers of this world, whereby they pitch one aspect of popular culture up against what appears to be the polar opposite of it, and they ask you to pick a side. So in the 60s, you had the Beatles being put up there with the Rolling Stones, marketed as rivals. So in the early days, the Beatles were the clean-cut, nice group that your gran and your auntie would like, and the Rolling Stones were the bad boys. They were a bit edgy, a bit dangerous. If the Beatles were too soft for you, then you went with the Rolling Stones. You picked one or the other. But there's evidence to suggest that both of these groups had ties to Tavistock, and they were both involved in the culture creation that was going on in the 60s to change the fabric of society. As the 60s rolled on, we had the introduction of LSD and all these other psychedelics. The music changed, lifestyles changed, attitudes to sexuality, attitudes to family, all changed. And these groups played their part in changing that social dynamic. The same thing was going on over in the States in the 60s with the counterculture, flower power hippie scene and all the bands that came out of Laurel Canyon. So exactly the same dynamic was being rolled out in the States as we got in Britain. This was just the British version of it. So the Rolling Stones and the Beatles, very far from rivals, actually allies in the game together. And we've seen this one rolled out so many times. I'm old enough to remember in my school days when Spandau Ballet were being positioned against Duran Duran, and girls in my school had to pick which one of the groups they liked, you know. And then a bit later in the 90s, we had the Britpop movement, which was, you know, entirely constructed, and you had Blur being positioned against Oasis. Which one did you like? It's a classic dialectic. Either way, the system gets your mind. Some pictures of the Beatles with Jimmy Savile. Not the first time Jimmy Savile has been mentioned in this conference this weekend. So here they are, appearing to be in some kind of mind-controlled state. People will say they're just larking about, they're just having a laugh, you know. Here's another picture of the Beatles at one of their Christmas shows. So there was a period in 1964 where Jimmy Savile toured with the Beatles to some of their live shows. He opened up for them, he introduced them, and the Beatles themselves have told anecdotes about how he would ride around in this transit van with them. And after Jimmy Savile died, Paul McCartney made some kind of comment about they always felt he was a bit weird, he was a bit creepy, and they thought it was very strange that when he dropped them off late at night, when they'd just come back from a gig, he never invited them in for coffee. I can't imagine anything worse than going in for coffee with Jimmy Savile. But so here's another picture of them, and you've got Savile in his black and white coat here, again denoting that idea of duality. Here's another one from... that is Freddie Garrity of the group Freddie and the Dreamers, who was supporting the Beatles at that time. So we're fast forwarding now to 1967, and this is the Sgt. Pepper era of the Beatles. This is the Summer of Love, and there they are hanging out with Savile again, having a laugh with dodgy moustaches. So their association with him, you know, went on a few years. By this point, the Beatles' music had changed big time. So from the early days of nice boy meets girl love songs like She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand, they'd been through this period with the Rubber Soul album, where they were experimenting with things like Indian sitars and Eastern mysticism on the song Norwegian Wood, and on Tomorrow Never Knows, which marked a big changing point in the Beatles' music. That song was based on lyrics from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, as translated by Timothy Leary, the acid guru of the 1960s. So already they were starting to get into psychedelic, esoteric realms. And here we are in 1967, and they're still hanging out with Savile. So again, people will say, well, any group that was successful at that time kind of had to get on with Jimmy Savile and had to cooperate with him because he was the premier disc jockey of the time, and he was the host of Top of the Pops and all this. But it strikes me that there was a little bit of damage limitation going on when we all found out the truth about Jimmy Savile and what he liked to get up to in his spare time. Because as well as being a paedophile, we've also had multiple reports of him being some kind of dark wizard, some kind of sorcerer, some kind of occultist that was involved in all manner of rituals. So Paul McCartney went on the defensive at the time we found out about Savile by saying, oh yeah, there was something a bit suspect about him. We were never really sure about him, but that is the natural thing that you'd expect him to say in the circumstances, right? In the words of Mandy Rice Davis, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? From the movie Scandal, which is well worth watching. Moving on to some other telling pictures, and we're lapping at the fringes of Freemasonry again here. What we have is the group members putting their arm inside their jacket, denoting the idea of a hidden hand, a control system that remains occulted from view, but is actually pulling the strings of everything that happens in society. So an interesting pose for them to have chosen. Here's some more pictures of John and Paul concealing their arm in the same way. And many figures throughout history have given us this particular symbol. from George Washington to Karl Marx to Friedrich Nietzsche, Baron von Knieger, whoever he was, Joseph Stalin, Napoleon, these figures that we're all familiar with. And there they all are striking the same pose. Is this just coincidence? Is this them just trying to be cool and trendy and doing something interesting for the photograph or the portrait? Or are they giving us a little clue here, a little indicator of what it is they're a part of? Revelation of the method, placing the truth in plain sight. Another promotional picture for the Beatles, and you've got Paul striking the same pose there. And here's one of John and Paul greeting each other with a very interesting handshake. Note the position of the thumb. Later in his career, Paul formed Wings, of course, with Linda and Denny Lane. That was his project post-Beatles. And here he is flashing up a hand sign, which naysayers will claim is just a W for Wings. That's all he's doing, right? Same thing as the W of the Wu-Tang Clan. And Jay-Z's rock sign is entirely innocent. But is that really the case? And here's Linda, his first wife, giving us the same sign in the Wings days. Now, what this appears to be is a depiction of the Masonic compass that we get from that particular society. So it seems to be another little indicator of Masonic ties to the Beatles. Back to George Martin, the super producer, who was very much responsible for the Beatles' trademark sound, particularly in their latter days when they went into their orchestral period. They had very complex arrangements from the Sgt. Pepper album onwards. By that point, they'd ceased touring live. No more gigs after August 1966. And according to many researchers, this ties into what happened with Paul McCartney, where one version of him was taken out and another one stepped in. But as I say, that really is one for another day. You could do an all-dayer on that one. So George Martin is working here in the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, which is what he was involved with before he stepped in with the Beatles. He put out a record in 1962 under the pseudonym of Ray Cathode. And I forget the name of it, but it very much predated his work with the Beatles. So here's an excerpt from my book, Musical Truth, Volume 1. I've got a whole chapter on the Beatles. It's chapter 4, examining many of the things that I've got in this talk and other stuff besides. So from that, it states, the dark manipulations of the music business are as old as the industry itself, and early examples of the dubious calling cards evident are equally present in its formative years. Mind control, military intelligence, pedophilia, and occult fascination are, it seems, nothing new. And you do find that where you get one of these elements, the others are never far behind. And a valid question would be, why should any of them be connected with the music industry at all? Why should you expect to find pedophilia or the meddlings of military intelligence in what is supposed to be all about fun and entertainment and enjoying yourself, right? Well, we find evidence of it time and time again. That's why my book is 180,000 words. The writer, okay, so I'm referring to another blog site here, I believe. The writer speculates on there being an organised link between the British music scene of the mid to late 1960s and that which emerged out of LA's Laurel Canyon district in the same time frame, as I just stated, all connected by British and US government, military and intelligence services. So the suggestion is that like the Beatles, the Rolling Stones were a creation of some arm of the British government. That's just recapping on what I've just said, basically. So we have some very loose ties between the Beatles and Laurel Canyon, that neighborhood in LA that was responsible for putting out so many of the groups that were instrumental in the counterculture scene of the mid to late 1960s, all detailed in Dave McGowan's brilliant book, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, which really shone a light on all these military family connections to all these prominent musicians. And you find that almost without fail, every time you get one of these musicians whose output changed the cultural standpoint of the times, you have a father that had a very prominent position in military circles or was connected in some way to the government or the Pentagon or something like this. So this is the Beatles' press officer Derek Taylor at the typewriter there, who was with the group in their early years. In the middle of the 60s, he split from the Beatles camp. He relocated himself in LA, and he became a publicist for many of the groups coming out of that scene, such as the Mamas and the Papas. And he was a co-curator of the Monterey Pop Festival in June 1967, which was a showcase for so many of these counterculture bands that were going to come and change society in the coming years. Paul McCartney was also on the advisory board of that particular event. So here's Derek Taylor hanging out with George Harrison sometime in someplace in LA. And this period was responsible for George's song Blue Jay Way that appeared on the soundtrack to Magical Mystery Tour later in 1967. He tells a story of a time when he was waiting at a house in LA for the rest of the Beatles to turn up, and they were late, and to pass the time, he just put this song together. It's very psychedelic. It's one of the Beatles' most trippy outings. Incidentally, George Harrison, when he passed away eventually in 2001, he was very badly attacked in his house, Friar Park in Henley-on-Thames, in late December 1999, when an attacker broke in and bypassed his state-of-the-art security system, somehow managed to get past it, and stabbed George up really badly. And George was saved by his wife, Olivia, who apparently came and beat the attacker and managed to ward him off. George was very seriously hurt, but he didn't die at the time. But a couple of years later, he finally succumbed to cancer that had been brought on, apparently, as a result of that attack. And it only came to light very recently that the house in which he died in Los Angeles just happened to be owned by Paul McCartney. When you looked on Wikipedia up until fairly recently, it told you it was a different house in a different district of LA, but it does turn out now that it was a house owned by Paul. So it's another interesting link there with LA and Laurel Canyon. LA was also the site of John Lennon's fabled Lost Weekend period. This is where, round about 1973-74, he was reportedly going through some difficulties in his marriage with Yoko Ono. I can't imagine anything more difficult than being married to Yoko Ono. So her suggestion was that to save their marriage, he should take off with their secretary, May Pang, who you see him kissing here, and go off and have a blast and just go on a massive bender for a few months. So that's exactly what he did. He went and based himself in LA. He started hanging out with guys like Harry Nilsson here and getting pissed with him on the Sunset Strip and just having a party, you know, with May Pang at his side. And then he returned to the marital home some months later to try and patch up his marriage with Yoko. It's a very bizarre state of affairs, but it's very consistent with the idea that Yoko was actually some kind of mind control handler that was sent into John's world to have that kind of effect on him. It's a very strange story either way. Harry Nilsson owned an apartment in London, and this was the site in 1974 of Mama Cass Elliot of the Mamas and the Papas passing away when, according to the official story, she choked on a cheese sandwich, you know, like you do. So she died in Harry Nilsson's apartment in 1974. 4 years later, 1978, Keith Moon, the drummer with The Who, just happens to turn up dead in the very same apartment in very strange circumstances. Some kind of overdose, we're told. So Harry Nilsson's gaff is not the place to stay when you go to London, trust me. More Egyptian symbolism here. This is the most recent album from Paul McCartney, which was put out last year, called Egypt Station. There's a few hints of Sgt. Pepper here in the sleeve, in some of the iconography. There's all kinds of occult symbolism going on there, and there's this veneration of Egyptian sun cults as well, going back to that. When we look back at his album Ram, which he put out in the early 70s, we get more of that, and we get him interacting with this ram creature, which was one of the entities that was revered by these ancient Egyptian cultures. And also, McCartney put out an album in 1977 of orchestral arrangements of earlier songs under the pseudonym of Percy Thrillington. And on the sleeve to this album, he's depicted with the head of a ram, again, important to these ancient Egyptian civilizations. And another entity that this culture apparently revered was a frog that resided in the Nile River. Now, this is where we get into an article from a good friend of mine, Matt Sergiu, who runs a fascinating blog which is called Occult Beatles. And he is a very impeccable researcher. He's a lifelong Beatles fan, and he's really delved into these hidden aspects of the group and what they're all about. I highly recommend a look at his blog. It's on WordPress. You can just type in Occult Beatles WordPress, and you should find it there. I did a presentation with him in Bristol a few months ago where we both presented information of this nature. So he put out a fascinating article earlier this year looking into how the ancient Egyptians revered this entity known as Heket. And he stated, Heket is symbolically connected to the Nile, as is Khnum, who's been dubbed the King of Frogs. The 19th century poet and writer and researcher of ancient Egypt, Gerald Massey, states in his written work, the frog was a lunar type. The name of the frog in Egyptian is Ka, and so on. So does anyone know where we're going with this? Does anyone remember this record, which came out in 1984? And it baffled people, because they were like, what the hell is Paul McCartney, this great accomplished musician, putting out this bullshit kids record just before Christmas with Rupert Bear called Paul McCartney and the Frog Chorus, We All Stand Together? Well, Matt's conjecture is that in the video to this song, where we had these cartoon frogs and such, it could well be a nod to these Egyptian cultures and the way that they would revere these entities that were symbolized as frogs. It certainly would explain why that song was put out, and something has to. The Beatles in Hannibal Lecter-style face masks. Nothing unusual about that, just another day at the office. John Lennon with one eye covered with a flower, again bringing this one eye symbolism, the eye of Providence, the all-seeing eye, all of this, the eye of Horus. Talking of eyes, here's 4 different pictures of McCartney from 4 different phases of his career where he's striking the same pose mid-interview that somebody has cleverly put together in a montage. So is this just a subconscious gesture that he just happened to do and the photographer caught it at the time, or is there more being communicated here, given that he's covering the same eye? And another question would be, is it the same Paul? But again, that can wait till another day. This is from the sleeve to the Yellow Submarine album that came out as the soundtrack to accompany the animated movie. You got McCartney doing a very familiar symbol in popular culture. We see artists doing it to this very day. You also see politicians and world leaders and business leaders flashing up this same sign whenever there's a camera in sight. And it's a depiction of the 666. So he's making a 6 sign with his hand, and he's got the 3 fingers up, denoting that it's a 6 to the power of 3, or 3 times, i.e. 666. Again, a very important number to the dark occultists who control these industries. And Lennon is giving the horned hand sign, so-called, which sometimes is flashed with the palm outwards and sometimes with the palm facing towards him. And this is a depiction of the Baphomet, which we also encountered in Nathan's talk earlier. Another emblem, another motif that is very precious to the occult controllers of these industries. So it's another little calling card, it's another little reminder of what it is this group is a part of and what they really represent. Ringo from the movie The Magic Christian, which came out in 1969, where he starred alongside Peter Sellers, he just doesn't seem to be able to stop putting his hand in this sign. Looks like a nasty case of arthritis for poor old Ringo. And this is from the animated version of Yellow Submarine. Even in cartoon form, you get the same hand signs being put in there. So is this going to be any kind of accident? Is it going to be any kind of coincidence? Or was it entirely intended for this to be put out there and to be absorbed into the subconscious mind of the viewing public? We're back to the aforementioned Yoko in a witch's outfit here, as if there was any doubt about it. And I've already mentioned that there's a suspicion that her role may have been as some kind of mind control handler of John. Certainly, his personality changed big time shortly after she came on the scene. Incidentally, they're said to have met on the 9th of November, 9/11, 1966. So yesterday, if I had been doing this talk, it would have been beautiful synchronicity, because it would have been 9/11 then as well. But 9/11 is a very important date in the Beatles' history. Other events have occurred on that particular date over the years. So when John met Yoko, his entire demeanor seemed to change. So during the Beatles' years, particularly in the early days, he was the clown, he was the joker in the group. He was always larking around. He did things like making fun of disabled people, which is not the funniest thing in the world, but it's one of the things that he used to enjoy doing. So it just indicates that he was always playing the joker. And after Yoko arrives on the scene, he starts to become very introspective, very serious, and he starts to become a political activist. He starts making songs like Power to the People and Working Class Hero and Give Me Some Truth and all this sort of stuff. And his music through the 70s is some of the most conscious and meaningful music that you've ever got from a mainstream artist. You can question how sincere the songs were, and you can ask whether they were all part of some other kind of agenda, but either way, it was music of the type that we no longer get in the pop charts. So something had happened to him, his personality had changed, he started hanging out with people like Jerry Rubin and Abbie Hoffman, these political activists of the time, and that was his life through the 1970s, all the way up to December 1980, when we're told he was assassinated by Mark Chapman. And I have to say things like "we're told" because I can no longer be sure of anything when it comes to official stories. I do have to question the official version of everything, but according to the record, of course, he was taken out in 1980, and if you accept that that's what actually happened, and you get the idea of him having got up the nose of the establishment, having become a bit of a loose cannon, a bit of a pain in the arse, particularly to the Nixon administration and then the incoming Reagan-Bush administration in 1980, he'd become somebody that was an undesirable, and that is the justification that's given for him having been taken out. So here's Yoko with an album of hers called Yes, I'm a Witch, just in case there was any doubt. And there she is with her transhumanist AI sunglasses as well, as a precursor to that particular agenda. With Beatle wives, we have to throw Linda into the mix. Paul McCartney's wife, originally known as Linda Eastman. She became Linda McCartney when she married Paul in 1969, the same year that John got married to Yoko. Now, there is a particular town in Westchester County, New York, in the United States, called Scarsdale. And it's very important to the Beatles story because this is the town where Linda grew up and attended high school. Her family came from there. It also happens to be a town where Yoko's family relocated for a period in the 1950s when her father, who was a very prominent banking magnate, needed to spend some time in the States. So he moved the family over from Japan. On her mother's side, Yoko is descended from Japanese royalty, by the way, the Japanese emperor. When you trace the family tree, that's where she comes from on her mother's side, and on her father's side, it's a prominent banking dynasty. So that might give some clue as to why she, in particular, was inserted into the Beatles story and into John's life. But the thing about Scarsdale is that you have two future Beatles wives who would both get married to the group members in 1969, both growing up in this obscure town round about the same time. So Yoko moved over with her family, and she's living in Scarsdale round about the same time as Linda McCartney. Then, when you look further into the town of Scarsdale, you discover that these two are very far from the only famous people that have come up out of that particular town. Looking down this list, which is actually on Wikipedia, you get the likes of Judy Garland, Al Jolson, who else? Susan Lucci, Maria Liasson, Rupert Holmes, Bruce Beck, lots of famous names, all coming out of Scarsdale. So what is it about that particular town that has bred so many individuals that have gone on to become famous and influential in society? There's something about Scarsdale, I would suggest. Looking at John's offspring, his son Sean, who he had with Yoko, became a musician himself. This is from one of his recent music videos. We have some very familiar, tried and tested symbolism being pushed by Sean. He's got his Freemasonic pyramid hat here with the Eye of Horus on it. And then John's first son with his first wife, Cynthia, Julian Lennon, is pushing one-eye symbolism again. It's the same old stuff we see from so many artists in the industry. So what's going on here? Have John Lennon's sons been co-opted into the industry machine against their will? Or is it the case that John himself was always a part of these institutions and his sons are just following in his footsteps on a familial basis? This is another question we have to ask ourselves. Another very famous Beatles album to get into when it comes to symbolism is Yesterday and Today, which was released in June of '66, or 666, and this is the original version of the album. This was put together by an Australian photographer by the name of Robert Whittaker, and we have the four Beatles here in white lab coats, covered in raw meat and mutilated dolls with their heads and their arms pulled off. It's a charming sleeve, I'm sure you would agree. It's family friendly and it's a lovely thing that makes you feel all fuzzy inside. There was actually an outcry, quite rightly, about this sleeve when it was initially presented, and people thought it was disgraceful and outrageous, and the Beatles camp were forced to withdraw this sleeve very quickly, pull back all the units that had been put out, and replace it with a new sleeve. So they simply pasted over the old picture with the new one. And if you have a copy of this album floating around in your garage, hold on to it, because they're worth literally hundreds of thousands now. They are very serious collector's items. So when it gets to interpretations of what this sleeve could be all about, we have a couple of articles to go into. So according to this one, Paul looks skyward like an angel of death. An umbilical cord dangles limply from his wrist. It was very tasty meat, said Paul, which is an interesting comment for one of the world's most famous vegetarians to make. Although, to be fair, he didn't become vegetarian until he met Linda. So here's a reminder of how much you can get for one of these original sleeves of Yesterday and Today. Now, this is the image that was used to replace the offensive one. And in this one, we have the group sitting around one of these old steamer trunks, which were used in the days of seafaring vessels, when people used to travel by liner ships. And we have Paul sitting inside this steamer trunk, and the others sitting around it. Now, this is a very incisive interpretation of what's being conveyed here from a blog site that I found. This person states, the album cover is a representation of the story of Osiris, whose body parts were put into a casket, a trunk that washed up on the shore and was found by Isis, his wife. In other variations, she put the casket out to sea. The original butcher cover for the album represented Osiris having been chopped into 13 pieces by his brother Set. I remember when we saw those grade signs from the OTO on the sleeve of Help, the position that Paul is taking on the sleeve corresponds to Osiris risen in that particular system. So in the legend, Isis reassembled the body parts, brought the body back to life long enough to have sex with it, and subsequently bore Horus, who avenged his father's death by engaging Set in a battle. Horus was considered to be the reincarnation of his father Osiris. This person says, the two Pauls represent Osiris and Horus, the same guy in two bodies. A rubber soul, to use the title of their album, occupying two bodies. In order for Beatles fans to connect the dots, there had to be clues about a death. Osiris died, was reborn as Horus. Yesterday and Today was a phrase used in ancient Egypt, describing Osiris in the same way that some people say Jesus Christ, the same yesterday, today, and forever in this era. So the focus here of all the band members is specifically on Paul, and this ties into the conspiracy theory that just won't go away, that the individual we have today is not the original Paul McCartney, or at the very least, there have been two Paul McCartneys. It's not the case that we've had just one of them in the narrative all this time. As I start to wrap up, we can look at some untimely deaths of people closely associated with the Beatles camp. This is worth spending a minute or two on. So we've already discussed Stuart Sutcliffe up here in the top left, the original early bassist of the Beatles. In the middle there, we have Brian Epstein, the Beatles' manager. He's said to have discovered them and plucked them from obscurity in Liverpool when he went to see them play at a club. He owned a record store. It was a family business, and he decided to become a manager and hawk the Beatles around and try and get them a record deal. And eventually EMI picked them up after, we're told, Decca passed on them and said, no thanks. And then 6 months later, Love Me Do becomes this massive worldwide hit. That's the official version of things anyway. Incidentally, EMI and Decca are two record labels that have very strong ties to the military and military intelligence. Most of the big record labels of the 50s, from EMI to RCA to Parlophone, have backgrounds in work for military institutions. For instance, RCA was the Radio Corporation of America. It was developed by the US Navy, originally working on radar and radio and sonar systems. And EMI was Electrical Musical Industries that had similar ties into the British military. But there's nothing unusual about that, right? So Brian Epstein died in August 1967 at the age of 32 of, we're told, some kind of overdose. So this is directly after the Beatles have released the Sgt. Pepper album, this genre-defining, era-changing piece of work, and then Brian checks out a couple of months after that, and the Beatles are left effectively without a manager for the rest of their careers. They just handled that side of things themselves. So it's all a bit suspicious. It was very sudden, and if you look at interviews of the group in the wake of Brian Epstein's death, where they're being asked about it by a reporter, it really does seem as if they were not expecting it. John Lennon in particular looks very shell-shocked and just doesn't know what to do. You can find that footage on YouTube. The guy here in the top right is Dr. Richard Asher, and he is the father of Jane Asher, who was the girlfriend of Paul McCartney for a big part of the 1960s. Richard Asher worked in hypnotism, and he worked in various other aspects of psychology and neurology, and evidently had ties to the British government and research on behalf of these military intelligence institutions. He had a practice in Wimpole Mews in London, which was also his house, and Paul McCartney is said to have moved in there for a long period in the 60s when he was dating Jane Asher, and that became his home. And so Asher very quickly gave up the post that he had at the Central Middlesex Hospital at the time Paul McCartney moved into his home. And there is a suspicion among some researchers that that is the point where McCartney became some kind of mind control subject to the experiments that Dr. Richard Asher was conducting. Jane Asher's mother, Margaret, was a music teacher, and she just happens to have taught piano and oboe to George Martin, who went on to become the Beatles' producer. And Jane had a brother, Peter Asher, who was part of the group Peter and Gordon, who had a hit with A World Without Love, and that song is said to have been written by Paul McCartney. So there's connections going on for days. Many researchers in recent times have questioned whether the song Yesterday, Paul McCartney's most famous composition, could actually have been implanted into his subconscious mind as part of some kind of mind control experiment at the hands of Dr. Asher and his wife Margaret, who was a music teacher and songwriter. It's interesting that we've just had the movie Yesterday. If anyone's seen that, it's bloody awful. It's a Richard Curtis movie, what do you expect? But when you look at what's being conveyed in the narrative, you have this guy who is a musician passing himself off as somebody who he's not. You have the idea of somebody claiming to have written songs that they didn't really write, and you have characters in the movie who discover the deception but say they don't really care as long as the musical legacy continues. So it's interesting timing that that movie has just come out, and it focuses specifically on the song Yesterday, supposedly written at the time that McCartney was staying in Dr. Asher's house. Anyway, Dr. Asher turned up dead in the basement of his house in 1969. Shortly before Paul went on to marry Linda, he'd ended his relationship with Jane Asher by that point. And Dr. Asher goes missing for a few days, and the family don't know where he's gone, and then a few days later, he turns up in the basement. And the official verdict is he committed suicide. Like you do. On the bottom left here, we have Mel Evans, who I made a brief reference to earlier. Alongside Neil Aspinall, he was another of the Beatles' close confidants. He was a roadie, he was an assistant. He was very much a part of the Beatles' inner core. In early 1976, he was all poised to publish a book, which was his memoirs, talking about his years working with the Beatles. The manuscript was all ready to be delivered to the publisher. Then on, I believe it was the 4th of January 1976, Mel Evans, who was living in LA at the time, gets into some sort of altercation with LA police, who it was claimed that he was drunk and he was becoming unpredictable and he was behaving in a pretty unruly way. And so the police were called, and it resulted in a gun battle in which Mel Evans was shot dead by the LAPD. And at that point, the manuscript to his upcoming book went missing and has never been seen to this day. So there's another unusual one to throw into the mix. John Lennon in the middle, at the bottom there, we already know about, ostensibly murdered by Mark Chapman on the 8th of December 1980. And then we have George on the bottom right there, who passed away in 2001. We mentioned him earlier. So, wrapping up, I just want to leave you with a couple of lyrics which speak to what we've been discussing here, the dynamics of social engineering, culture creation, thought entrainment. This lyric comes from the song by The Who, Won't Get Fooled Again. It's right there in the title, where they say, "There's nothing in the streets looks any different to me, and the slogans are replaced by the by. And the parting on the left is now the parting on the right, and the beards have all grown longer overnight." In that song, they're talking about how all this gets done, how heroes and role models are presented to the general public. We don't choose them, they get served up to us. We can choose whether we embrace them or not, but in most cases, when the general public is given somebody and they're told, this person is great, this band is fantastic, you need to support them, they do just that. And as we discover so many times, when you look into who these people really were, it's very rare that you discover that they were regular working class people with dads from professions like construction, docking, mining, bus drivers, lorry drivers. I've said many times that when it comes to the fathers of musicians in bands, I would expect to find those kind of jobs cropping up very frequently. But you don't. When it comes to the fathers' professions, you find generals, admirals, diplomats, politicians, people that worked in the Pentagon, the Defense Department, people that worked in British military intelligence. What are the odds of this being the case if these musicians are just working themselves up under their own steam on an organic, natural, grassroots basis? That's not what's happening, of course. The Who were in a very good position to know, and they were commenting on this in this particular song. So they would have the original incarnation of the Beatles as these lovable, clean-cut lads. And by the end of their career, they've got the hippie look, they've all grown their beards, they've been through the LSD psychedelic phase, they've changed societal attitudes, they've done the job they were putting there to do, and they're all ready to wrap the whole thing up. To end on another Beatles song lyric, "It took me so long to find out, and I found out," and that's from Day Tripper. All right, so I'm pretty much done here. Just want to mention that a lot of what I've discussed is contained in volume 1 of my book, Musical Truth. I've got some copies on the table at the back there. It's in chapter 4. I've got another book coming out very soon as well, and you're among the very first people to see the sleeve of it. This is an allegorical novel that I've been writing over the last few months. I've had an absolute blast doing it. It's been a wonderful experience. I can't wait to unleash it. Beneath the surface narrative, there's all kinds of natural law teachings, spiritual truths, and just general truth bombs being dropped on you in encoded form if you know how to read it. And I suspect most people in this room will know how to strip away the layers and get some hidden meanings from this book. So look out for that. That's going to be out next month, hopefully. I do like to end on this one, because that's about it. Just before I finish, I do want to say big respect to Trevor. Once again, let's give him another big up for putting this event on. I know he's been through. He's been through a whole.
John and the guys as well. I mean,
everyone else as well. Yeah, of course. They've been through a whole world of crap putting this event on. They don't deserve it. They've come with the best of intentions. They're trying to make the world a better place, and they've had to combat all this madness that they've had from these individuals outside. And it brings to mind another famous song lyric from Jim Morrison and the Doors: "People are strange, aren't they just?"
Mark Devlin, folks. Big round of applause.